Herzlich willkommen zu unserer dritten Online-Veranstaltung zu den Europawahlen. Heute wollen wir über die US-Präsidentschaftswahlen sprechen, die für Arbeiter auf der ganzen Welt von größter Bedeutung ist. Die USA sind die wichtigste imperialistische Macht. Sie unterstützen den schrecklichen Völkermord in Gaza. Sie eskalieren pausenlos den Krieg gegen Russland und bereiten einen noch umfassenderen Krieg gegen China vor. Trump und Biden unterstützen beide diesen brutalen Kriegskurs. Und ich bin deshalb sehr froh, dass wir heute mit Joseph Kishore sprechen können, der diesen beiden Kandidaten des Big Business entgegentritt und als sozialistischer Kandidat zu den Präsidentschaftswahlen antritt. Joe ist der nationale Sekretär der Socialist Equality Party, der Schwesterpartei der Sozialistischen Gleichheitspartei in den USA, und er ist seit 25 Jahren in der trotzkistischen Bewegung aktiv. Wir werden dieses Treffen jetzt in englischer Sprache weiterführen, und wer Schwierigkeiten hat, dem zu folgen, der kann das Video dann später ansehen, wenn wir deutsche Untertitel hinzugefügt haben, die wir so schnell wie möglich erstellen werden. Alle, die jetzt hier live teilnehmen, können den YouTube-Chat nutzen, um in die Diskussion einzugreifen. Stellt Fragen an Joe, bringt Punkte auf. Das alles könnt ihr machen über den YouTube-Chat und wir werden uns dann bemühen, diese Fragen in der Diskussion zu berücksichtigen. Wie immer werden wir am kommenden Donnerstag um 19 Uhr nochmal zu einer Online-Diskussion einladen, wo wir dieses Video diskutieren wollen und die Fragen, die aufgekommen sind. Registriert euch dafür unter gleichheit.de/Termine. But yes, let's start. Welcome, Joe. We are glad to have you here today because the US presidential elections are clearly an international event. And
yes, sorry.
Yeah, and it's very significant for the whole international working class that a socialist candidate like you stands in these elections and is fighting to mobilize the American working class, the only social force on this planet that can fight US imperialism. And indeed, we are witnessing a growing movement against the genocide in Gaza in the US that is spreading throughout the world, also to Germany. Students are occupying campuses, university buildings, and they are met with enormous brutality by the state and by the police in the US, but also here in Germany. And basically in every single imperialist country. And you, in your statements and your articles, often explained that the working class has to come to the defense of the students. So can you give us a picture of the situation in the US and explain this perspective of the mobilization of the working class?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me on this very important discussion. When we launched the Socialist Equality Party election campaign, Jerry White, my running mate, and I emphasized that we were not simply running a national campaign, that all the problems confronting workers in the United States are essentially the same problems that confront workers throughout the world, and that the problems that we confront, the international working class confronts, are global problems. It's now centered in the escalating global war, of which the genocide in Gaza is one component, but all of the issues that we confront are global questions. Of course, we've gone through the experience of the pandemic, the growth of the far right and the destruction of democratic rights internationally, the growth of inequality and exploitation, climate change. These are all global questions that can only be resolved through a fight to mobilize the international working class against capitalism on a world scale. So I think just to preface the answer to that question, I think that it is very important that we develop, and I know, of course, this is your own conception in the European election campaign as well, that we are developing a global offensive, and that we're fighting to bring, through our election campaign, an internationalist perspective into the American working class. Your question about the fight to mobilize the working class against the genocide, it's a central issue. Of course, there have been, as you referred to, very, very significant protests, demonstrations since the genocide began, now more than 7 months ago, against what is one of the, if not the greatest war crime in the recent period. Millions and millions of workers throughout the world are horrified by what is happening. Here in the United States, there have been ongoing and significant protests which are centered on the campuses against the genocide. In our election campaign and in the work of the Socialist Equality Party as a whole, we are really fighting to develop an understanding within the working class that this is its fight. And I would say that there's significant opposition, widespread opposition to the genocide in the working class. There is not a broad base of support, certainly, as well as for the escalating US-NATO war against Russia over Ukraine. But the development of an understanding within the working class that it is the social force that has to fight against the war, that has to fight against the genocide, to develop very concretely the understanding that this is its fight. The war abroad is also a war on the working class at home. Those who will be mobilized to fight in the escalating global war are the sons and daughters of the working class, that the workers are being forced to pay for it, that it's not in the interest, that the workers are being killed in these wars, workers all over the world, that it is in the interest of the working class to fight against war, and that the fight against war is at the same time the fight of the working class against capitalism, against imperialism. That is really the central issue which we're seeking to develop in the and in that context, fight to develop among students who are engaged in the protest an understanding that the revolutionary force is the working class. So we can discuss certainly further the experiences here. There is, as I said in the course of our election campaign and speaking to workers at the factories and the workplaces, there is a lot of opposition. The support for the war is primarily, I'm speaking here about the war against Russia, primarily within the framework of the privileged sections of the upper middle class. Within the working class, there is not. But that isn't yet mobilized, it isn't really conscious. And workers in particular are not really aware of the extent of the advanced preparations for a far more massive acceleration of the global war.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the massive state repression, you get a sense how afraid the ruling class is about the opposition to war within the working class, even if it does not find at the moment an open expression. Yeah. But without a question, you have this huge opposition against a genocide, against an out-and-out war against Russia. And at the same time, you have this situation that the ruling class as a whole, and that's also a phenomenon which you can see internationally, that the ruling class as a whole is moving towards war and connected to this, deeply connected to this, to dictatorship. And you have, of course, in the US, you have Trump, who is a fascist, who is openly declaring that he wants to build a dictatorship. But what is also very clear is that Biden is actually putting it into place. He's organizing it at the moment at the universities with the suppression of any opposition to the war. We have a very similar situation here. Of course, you have the AfD, which is a fascist party, which was systematically built by the state and by the other parties in order to suppress opposition to war. But you can see now the traffic light coalition is basically implementing dictatorial measures. The Berlin state government is implementing dictatorial measures, as you could just see at the Humboldt University, where they really attacked students violently. And so that stands very much against the argument of lesser evil, which you are probably very often confronted with in the US. We have to stop Trump. But now everybody can see Biden is a president of war, and he's a president also of dictatorship.
Yeah, well, first of all, the images of the German police brutally repressing the protesters at Humboldt University were striking, and seen around the world that such things are being again done in Germany, but against protests over a genocide. And of course, all in the fraudulent lying framework that somehow the protests against this genocide are anti-Semitic, which they can shout until they're blue in the face, but no one believes it, even as many of those who are being arrested and brutalized are themselves Jewish. But this is an international phenomenon. And yes, it's being overseen by the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, implemented in states and cities, whether it's Republicans or Democrats that control them. Of course, university administrations, which often are very closely tied to the Democratic Party, inviting police onto the campuses to arrest students. That was what happened at Columbia University, which was sort of an initial stage in the acceleration of the repression of students was at Columbia. And the university president actually sanctioned the students, not disenrolled, but basically sanctioned them in order to allow her to call in the police and to arrest them and to break up the protests. I mean, this is what's happening. And it's the Democrats and the Republican Party which is doing it. Well, and just in relationship to the working class, we have been really fighting to develop an understanding within the working class that it is the social force which has to defend democratic rights, that the opposition to war and the defense of democratic rights are really one and the same. And the methods being used against the students will be used against all opposition, including among workers. But yes, it's the entire political establishment. I mean, the question of lesser evil, of course, often comes up continuously in one form or another, although it's been profoundly undermined by experiences. But somehow that, one has to support the Democratic Party in order to stop Trump, although is one of the strange consequences of the political situation is that one's beginning to find occasionally people who say one has to vote for Trump in order to stop Biden, just because of the the incredible brutality which the Biden administration is responsible for. But yes, it's the age-old issue of the Democratic Party and the sort of the lesser evil. You only have two choices, Biden or Trump, and we have to support the Democratic Party in order to prevent the Republicans from coming back into power. Adolph Reed Jr. wrote an article in The Nation. He's a sort of left academic a few weeks back, in which he said that he was voting for evil, that is for Biden, just because of how dangerous Trump is. I think that events themselves have undermined the argument. I mean, the Biden administration is itself culpable in the genocide. 45,000 people now dead. There's not a single bomb that could be dropped in Gaza without the financial, political, and military support of the United States, of American imperialism, of the Biden administration. It is fully culpable, and the charges of war crimes that are justly and correctly being brought against Netanyahu, Gallant, and other fascists in the Israeli state can and should be leveled against Biden, as well as Sunak and Schultz and Macron and everyone else in the governments of the imperialist powers. So that has had an impact. I think, though, as well, it's important to understand that the Biden administration has done everything it could and can to revive, to strengthen the Republican Party. It's continually referred to as its Republican friends. It began with Biden, who said that his aim, this was right after the coup of January 6th, I think it was on January 9th, that he said, 2021, that he said his aim was to ensure a strong Republican Party. And the central motivation for that is his effort to create a bipartisan support for the war abroad, and particularly the war against Russia. And even in the past several months, there's in effect a coalition government which has been established in the United States between the Biden administration and the Republican-led House of Representatives. The House Speaker who leads the House is Mike Johnson, he's very close to Trump. He was one of those who backed and provided political justification for the coup of January 6th. And they came together to pass a record military spending bill, $858 billion, I believe, as well as the spending bill for additional funding for the war in Ukraine and for the genocide in Gaza, $17 billion for the genocide, $61 billion for the escalation of the war against Russia, as well as important measures for the conflict with China. They all came together. And then they came together to denounce the protests as anti-Semitic. Johnson got up at a speech on Holocaust remembrance with Biden. They were all there together and had the audacity to lyingly declare that students protesting the genocide were akin to Nazis. That's what he said. And he was there with Biden, and Biden was denouncing anti-Semitism, and they're all there together to denounce the students for opposing a genocide. So they've effectively come together on the basis of support for imperialist war and opposition to the protests against the genocide. They are absolutely united on the support for the escalation of the assault on the working class. So you have, I mean, the argument somehow, and then Biden even said, you know, the Democrats got up just last week and said what their final thing that they want to do, which they've been blocked from doing from the Republicans, is to pass a massive crackdown on immigration and refugees on the border. And they've sought to get a bipartisan agreement with the Republicans in order to do that, but they were going to do it on their own. So they have done so, and that has all created the conditions, the whole reactionary policy of the Biden administration for Trump to now emerge. He's still the head of the Republican Party. So, I mean, the idea that somehow you can stop fascism and stop Trump by supporting the Biden administration has been refuted by the past 4 years. And of course, the Biden administration itself is now guilty of such monstrous crimes. But sorry, the final point, and I think this is in some way the most essential on the question of the lesser evil, is it's all designed to prevent an understanding of what is the basic and urgent necessity all over the world, in the United States, the independent intervention of the working class, which is the central question. There will not be an end to the genocide. There will not be an end to the escalating global war, which threatens nuclear catastrophe. There will not be the defense of democratic rights. None of the problems without the intervention of the working class. And that is the essential issue. And the development within the working class of a socialist consciousness, an understanding that it is fighting against capitalism. And all the arguments which are made to channel opposition behind the Democratic Party or one or another faction of the political establishment. And again, you have it. I'd be interested to hear more of how it's expressed in Europe, but you have it there. It's all aimed at blocking that. But nothing can be resolved without that. And whoever is in office, whether it's Biden or Trump, that is the issue. The working class has to intervene. As Trotsky called the interference of the masses in history. Well, there is a growing opposition, an objective movement. There's developing strike movements. Workers are enormously angry. There's deep hostility to the whole political system. But that has to find organized political expression. And that is the task of building a socialist leadership, which is, again, the basic issue. And I think all the arguments against, pragmatic arguments of one form or another, support this person, stop that person, support that person, stop this person, are all aimed at blocking that basic and urgent political task.
Yeah, because you can, pretty clearly see with the united front of the whole ruling class for war, for dictatorship, that on a capitalist basis, there's no way to stop the war and to stop the genocide, and that just the working class can stop it, but that this requires a socialist program. I mean, in Germany, this takes very sharp forms, and what you just reported about this anti-Semitism campaign, where you have now a united front of the whole ruling class in the fight against anti-Semitism, which means against anti-war protests, and the extreme right plays a central role in this. I mean, here you have the situation at Humboldt University that the same president that is defending the extreme right-wing Professor Barbarowski, who said Hitler was not vicious, and who said that the Red Army was responsible for the war of extermination of the Nazis. That the same president is now blaming anti-war protesters as anti-Semitic, and that there is no place for anti-Semitism at the Humboldt University. I mean, that are the curious forms it takes, but what it means is really that you have this, in Germany, it's from the AfD to the Left Party. Every single party is supporting the war policy, and in the US, it is both parties of big business, the Republicans and the Democrats, and all the different satellites who try to somehow give them any new credibility. But yeah, that shows somehow it is a question of capitalism. It's a question of imperialism, and it's of course not just Gaza. You already mentioned the war against Russia, which is also escalating, and it's again the case both in Germany and in the US that there is the discussion, and a very serious discussion to allow Ukraine, or basically to organize that Ukraine is using the weapons from the US to target targets in the mainland of Russia. So, which would really mean an enormous escalation and an acute danger of nuclear war. I mean, we said often this is that's the first front in the Third World War. The second front is the Middle East. What is behind this war development? And when we say the ruling class as a whole is going toward Third World War, what is behind it in the US? What is behind this enormous outbreak of militarism, war, and imperialism?
Well, that's a big question. Just first of all, on the issue of anti-Semitism, again, it is outrageous. David North, the WSW's chairman and SEP national chairman, made the point and referred to one of the lectures on Gaza, which are published in the recently published book by Mering Books on Zionism and the genocide in Gaza. The sort of linguistic inversion which has taken place, in which the anti-Semitism, which has been long promoted and been an element of the far right and continues to be, including in the Republican Party here, has somehow been turned into, or they're trying to turn it into, a characterization of the left in a completely lying, outrageously falsified way. And it is international. I mean, you have people like Stefanik, the Republican, going around about anti-Semitism, and she's provided legitimacy to the so-called Great Replacement theory, which was advanced by the protesters in Charlottesville back in 2017, who chanted, "Jews will not replace us," and that that's all legitimized by the Democratic Party as well. Anyway, perhaps we'll return to it. On the But actually, in relationship to the linguistic inversion, you have a similar phenomenon in which all opposition to the war against Russia, the NATO war against Russia, is turned into and argued as somehow the is expression of support for Putin, which is again a lie, and that's the lie that has been used to arrest our comrade Bogdan in Ukraine by this Nazi infested government operating under martial law, which I'm sure we'll return to further in this discussion. But that also is an exposure of the character of this war, the so-called war for democracy in Ukraine. What is behind this? I mean, it is an enormous escalation which is taking place. I think over even prior to the election, they want to organize a major escalation. All the talk about, long-distance weapons being utilized to target Russia, the discussions within Europe and within the United States over the direct deployment of NATO troops into the conflict. All the red lines that the Biden administration said couldn't be crossed because it would lead to World War III and are being crossed. It was incredible. A New York Times article last week, it began by saying, well, there's various red lines, including using long-range missiles to target Russia, which had been Biden administration policy not to do because it would lead to World War III. And then the next sentence was, well, that policy is being revised, which if taken literally means the policy of stopping the descent into World War III is no longer of consideration within the ruling class. But they have certainly made clear, and they have said repeatedly, that they will not, as they be deterred from an escalation of the war against Russia by the danger that this will lead to a third, or it will lead to a nuclear war. In some sense, it already is a third world war in the sense that we are in the midst of an escalating global conflict. But they are determined to pursue this war to victory. And what is behind it? I mean, it is, in a sense, from the geopolitical standpoint, the evolution of 30 years of unending war, which the International Committee of the Fourth International has analyzed over an extended period of time as the response of American imperialism to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, its long-term economic decline, escalating, unending war over the course of 35 years soon. One war after the next in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and now developing into a direct conflict involving Russia and, of course, China. It is the response of the American ruling class to this effort to utilize its military force to maintain its global hegemony. And these wars, as again Dave North referred to in the Quarter Century of War, which is a critical volume to read. I believe it was translated in German, 30 Years of War, when it was translated. It is a review of, it makes the point in the preface that they have to be understood in their logical connection. They're not sort of separate wars. They're really one war. And now that has developed into the war against Russia. And that's critical. They want to have access to the resources of Russia, the vast 8 time zones, or the vast expanse of Russian territory that Biden has often referred to. They want, the American corporations want access to it, rare earths and other materials, which is critical in their broader competition with China and with other imperialist powers. And they see the conflict with Russia as preparatory to taking on what they refer to as the big one, China. And it is the effort of the ruling class to use its military force to maintain its global hegemony under conditions of growing economic crisis. The past 30 years has seen one economic crisis after the next in the late 90s, and then the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2001, the financial collapse of 2008, the sort of breakdown, economic financial breakdown that happened during the pandemic, each followed by a massive bailout of the rich. But they confronted, that hasn't resolved any of the underlying economic problems. The question of the decline of the dollar is a serious concern for the American ruling class. And it utilizes its military force in order to preserve its global hegemony and therefore its profits. The final point, though, that I would add is I think a significant factor in the war is the domestic political situation. And there is always the compulsion of the ruling class to try somehow to use war as a means of directing social tensions outward. The foreign enemy, the sort of war hysteria, create the framework for domestic repression. You see what they're doing in response to the protests over the Gaza genocide. Create this, the terrorists and everything else, pro-Putin propagandists, and create the framework for repressing opposition, for repressing the working class, and somehow trying to divert tensions behind a war. And the American ruling class, you're right, I mean, it is very afraid. It's terrified of the development of a movement against war in the working class. That's what it's fearful of. And it's right to be fearful because there's enormous anger. So this country is a social powder keg, a political powder keg, and it's very fearful of that. So there is always that compulsion to try to use war to get out of its domestic problems. But it really confronts intractable problems. None of the actions taken by the ruling class resolve any of the issues that it confronts because it's bound up with the nature of the capitalist system. Anyway, I hope that answers the.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think pretty similar to the development before the First and the Second World War, where the capitalist crisis, the crisis of the nation-state system, could not be solved in an other way by capitalism than with the World War. And because you have the US as the biggest imperialist power, of course, but when you look at Germany, where also the militarism is coming back, because Germany also sees no other way to follow their interests internationally, to fight the interests of the capitalist class here, than by waging war, by building up the military. And that's true for all the imperialist countries, and that is what is leading towards exactly what we said, a Third World War. Now a lot of questions coming in from the chat, and a lot of them are somehow interested of your experiences in your election campaign. So what were the discussions with workers about? How did they respond to the socialist program? Or a bit more concrete, another user is asking, do the students connect the fight against the Gaza genocide with the US-NATO war against Russia? You're muted at the moment, I think.
Sorry. I would say, just in answer to the second question, do students connect the fight against the genocide in Gaza with the US-NATO war against Russia? I would say in a general way, no. And that's a real issue that we are confronting and fighting for and understanding in the election campaign. There's another question which is asking how relevant is a struggle for the freedom of the Ukrainian comrade Bogdan in the US election campaign? And I would say it is of enormous relevance. In some sense, it really has to be at the center. We have begun to fight to gather signatures. Well, we haven't begun. We've been fighting to gather signatures from students, from workers, from those who are involved in protests against the genocide in Gaza, to demand the freedom of Comrade Bogdan. This is a campaign which we are fighting, and of course, within the International Committee, are fighting to develop as really a central element of the political offensive. And it's very much connected to the other question, which is the relationship between the genocide and the US-NATO war against Russia. There's not broad support for the war against Russia. But I would say among students and also among workers, and this is, of course, a product, I would say, one of the capitalist propaganda machine, and two, the role of the pseudo-left elements around the Democratic Party. There is not an understanding, and I would say also the trade union apparatus, an understanding of the both the extent of the danger of the escalation of the war against Russia. Biden certainly is not getting on national television and explaining to the American people how many millions of people he's prepared to sacrifice for the aim of having Ukraine join NATO, let alone why that is of concern for the American people or the population of the world, or what the aims of the war are. There's no effort to explain. This is all, and the pseudo left covers this up. They in fact support the war against Russia, and so there's not an understanding, and we're fighting to develop that. But there's also not support. The support, as I said before, the support for the war against Russia is primarily within the layers of the upper middle class. When we speak to workers, there's opposition. The working class has no interest in this fight, but we have to fight to develop that understanding. We have to really, and it's a discussion that I've had countless times, and campaigners have had countless times with young people opposed to the genocide, to explain that this is part of a global war, to explain that the war against that it's connected to the war against Russia. It's the same forces. All those who claim that the war against Russia and Ukraine was about freedom and democracy are the same political forces that are supporting a genocide in Gaza. And of course, when you explain these issues, and then of course the real background, there is a response, and there's a real objective basis. But it's something we have to fight for. It's I think, a very central, critical political question in the development of a socialist consciousness in the working class, is the development of an understanding of the relationship between the genocide and the war against Russia, and the character of the war. And I think that, the fight to free Comrade Bogdan, is first of all fight for his freedom, but that's inextricably connected to the development of an understanding within the working class and among youth about the nature of the war, the nature of the regime, what it means to fight for an internationalist and socialist and revolutionary opposition to imperialism, opposition to all the capitalist governments. But the exposure of the nature of the war, of the imperialist war, of the nature of the Ukrainian government, and to fight for that in the working class. It's something that we have to really. It's a central issue in our election campaign. It's something we have to really intensify.
Yeah, and just to let everybody know, I mean, we raised it here as well in our two first meetings on the European elections, but Comrade Bogdan Sorotyuk was imprisoned by the Ukrainian regime because he's fighting for an internationalist socialist perspective, the unification of the Ukrainian and Russian working class on the basis of a socialist program, and that is why he was imprisoned. His life is in danger because the conditions of the prisons in Ukraine are horrible, and he is facing up to 25 years of imprisonment. So we are fighting for his release, for his freedom, and as Joe explained, this fight is of course a fight against imperialism. It's a fight against world war, and in this fight, the connection between the wars, the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine against Russia, is very central. And I think that was actually a very fundamental point Joe just made. It's the same imperialist powers who try to fight Russia and to suppress Russia in the war in Ukraine. It's the same imperialist powers are supporting the genocide, not to save Jewish lives in the region, but to wage war against Syria, against Iran, and to control the whole region. What they tried for 30 years now, or even more than 30 years, and what they are now trying to intensify, and all this is preparation for a war against China. And Joe just spoke about it, but that's really, I mean, that is a third world war we are talking about, and that means the destruction of the whole planet. I mean, in this regard, there's also the question of climate change that came up in the chat. And I mean, I think that is, of course, an important question, because it's no question that if there are not really harsh measures implemented now, the consequences will be catastrophic for this planet. But what you can see, and maybe you want to elaborate a bit on this, Joe, but what you can see is instead of having an international plan, a rational plan to fight climate change, you have the development of Third World War. And the imperialist powers are fighting to dominate the world, and it's far away from a scientific and rational planning of economy in order to stop climate change. Where we also had some important experiences with the pandemic, of course. It was the whole pandemic was dealt with from the standpoint of making the rich richer and kill the poor, basically. But yeah, maybe you want to deal with this question as well that came up into the chat.
Yeah, well, on the issue again of just before on that, the Gaza and Ukraine, to make it more concrete, you know, all the DSA members, there's a question in the chat about this role of the pseudo left, all the members of the Democratic Socialists of America in Congress voted for $61 billion for the escalation of the war against Russia. And then they, you know, postured as opponents of the Gaza genocide by voting against the funding for Israel, as if there's the good imperialist war, which is the war against Russia, but the bad war, the genocide in Gaza. But it's the same power that is carrying it out. It's the same government that's carrying it out. And of course, their support for the war against Russia also exposes the pretense of their criticism of the genocide in Gaza as well. This is part of a single global war and of imperialism. Climate change, the pandemic, as you say, the pandemic, and Comrade Evan Blake has stressed this point in many statements. The experience of the pandemic, the ruling class response to the pandemic has exposed the inability of the capitalist ruling class to respond to anything in a rational, scientific manner. What was the issue in the pandemic that prevented a scientific response to save lives? 27 million people dead now, including more than 1.5 million in the United States. It's ongoing. They're talking about the next virus, which is going to emerge, a summer surge here in the United States. It's all presented as if the pandemic is over. But what was the central issue? One, that capitalism was incapable of responding to a global virus through a global coordinated strategy because of the separation of the world into nation states. And that was the fundamental downfall of the Chinese zero COVID strategy as well. The division of the world into nation states makes it impossible to develop a global plan, and inextricably connected to that is the subordination of all policy to the interests of the corporate and financial oligarchy. And their line was, the cure can't be worse than the disease, which meant in reality that nothing could be done which would impact the stock market. And they funneled trillions into the markets. They reopened everything. Everything was subordinated to the markets. Better, I think as we said in a recent statement, better that a million, tens of millions die than $1 billion be lost in the stock markets. And that was the principle. But if one looks at climate change, it's the same basic questions. There's no national solution to climate change. There's only a global solution. And it has to be one that is based upon science, upon rational production, if one considers what is necessary to address climate change, the major changes in energy production, the massive investment in alternative sources of energy and clean sources of transportation, all of this requires a scientific, rational, globally organized plan, which is on the basis of social need, not private profit. And it can't be done within the framework of capitalism. That has been exposed. I mean, the necessity for socialism. The second part of that question is there even a realistic strategy for how rapid social change and consciousness can be achieved? Well, it has to be fought for. I mean, we're confronting a situation in which the ruling class is driving mankind towards catastrophe, towards the abyss of nuclear war, toward genocide has again been normalized in the vocabulary of political life. We've gone through the experience of the pandemic, which was seen as an opportunity to kill off a lot of old people, frankly. So they didn't have to spend so much money giving them health care. And it's still seen as that. The sort of eugenicist conceptions. And then you have climate change on top of all of that. I mean, I think David made the point in announcing our election campaign that the fight for socialism is not a utopian dream. It's an absolute necessity. Without it, capitalism is driving mankind towards a catastrophe. But what is really critical, of course, is, and this is the basis of our revolutionary optimism, is the understanding that there is a social force which has the power to put an end to capitalism and imperialism, and that's the international working class. And we have immense confidence in the revolutionary role of the working class, in particular the American working class. Hopefully this is something we can discuss further. But there is a working class in America, and it is a massive revolutionary force which can oppose American imperialism and the American ruling class. But the question of there's an objective basis, and there's a growing movement, and there'll be massive struggles. I mean, that we don't create that. What we have to do is impart a consciousness to them. And the success of the socialist revolution will be determined in struggle. It will be determined in one can sort of, there is a basis. We have to fight for it. And workers and young people who are drawing conclusions, who are going through the experience of the pandemic, who are beginning to see that it's not just one or another, there's no tinkering around the edges solution to the problems that we confront. There's only serious solutions to serious problems, and serious solutions are revolutionary solutions. Those who are drawing that conclusion have to take up the fight for it, and have to fight in the working class to develop that understanding, with a conviction and understanding that without that, well, it's socialism, as Luxemburg said, socialism or barbarism. And so, it's a question of struggle.
And I think in this regard, the question of the pseudo-left that came up in the chat is actually pretty significant. Because, I mean, the decisive question, as Joe just pointed out, is the independent mobilization of the working class. And when you look at the different pseudo-left groupings, and Joe just referred to the DSA, and what they are basically doing is channeling the growing opposition back to the Democrat, to subordinate any opposition to the bourgeois parties, to the trade unions, to the apparatuses. And that is really the basic principle of Trotskyism was ever the fight for the independence of the working class. And that is the only solution. We are not talking just about any mobilization of the working class. I mean, as Joe just put it, the struggles will come. We are not the ones that are somehow producing these objective contradictions. But the decisive question is whether the working class can intervene into the political situation as an independent force. And that, of course, requires a program, that requires to draw the lessons from history. And so maybe, Joe, you want to say a few words about this, our fight against the pseudo-left in the US, as part of the election campaign and as part of our international struggle, of course, against these tendencies in order to fight for the independence of the working class?
Sure. Another very big topic. Of course, there's the DSA, but there's different groups. I was just, or I went briefly to a conference that was held here in Detroit, organized by a number of groups, of which the Party for Socialism and Liberation is a major driving force. It's also called the Answer Coalition. It was, and there were a number of people there who are coming because they're horrified by the developments in Gaza and are looking for a way forward. But there was certainly no perspective advanced at the conference for that. In what we've been speaking about, no reference to Ukraine in the whole event. The question of the Democratic Party, it barely came up. I think there was one reference, and that was in advance of welcoming Rashida Tlaib, who's a Democratic Party congressman, to give a major address, which she said nothing about Biden, nothing about Ukraine. She was one of those who, in fact, voted for the $61 billion for the war against Russia. Then they were presented, they had a UAW official. The question of the trade union apparatus, all the pseudo-left groups have promoted the trade union apparatus, in particular Sean Fain, the new president of the United Auto Workers, as a great reformer who is transforming the labor movement. The UAW has played a central role, the apparatus, in suppressing opposition, in particular supporting the war, supporting the Biden administration. Fain has gone around talking about the arsenal of democracy, by which he means the arsenal of genocide and world war, and slanderously trying to associate the working class with support for the Biden administration's war policy. But the trade union apparatus is deeply integrated into the state, into management. The theory of the Democratic Party is corporatism, the utilization of the trade union apparatus to suppress the class struggle and support the ruling class war policy. And the pseudo-left groups are playing an ever more direct role. As I said, Fain was promoted by the DSA, by Labor Notes, by other organizations, as a great reformer. And now, they've been brought forward, and their task is to suppress the class struggle, to try somehow to preserve the apparatus and its control over the working class. So, the role of the pseudo-left groups, by which we mean organizations that represent sections of the upper middle class that are pro-war, that promote the politics of racial and gender identity. That's another thing which has been so exposed by developments. All the obsession over microaggressions. Well, now we're dealing with a macro genocide. We're dealing with massive social global problems. The obsessive fixation on issues of race and gender. The effort to falsify the history of the United States as the history of race conflict rather than class struggle, promoted by the New York Times and its 1619 project and taken up by the organizations of the upper middle class around the Democratic Party to promote divisions, to deaden or to pollute the consciousness of the working class, divide workers against each other. All of this demonstrates its reactionary character. That it is aimed at against what is required, the fight to unify the working class on the basis of a socialist understanding. So that's the role. And we're. I would say that. Of course, there's a constant and political fight for political clarification, the delineation of genuine Marxism, which is the Trotskyist movement. The bringing forward of the whole history of the Trotskyist movement into the present situation. And by which I mean not just the history going back now over 100 years, but even the more recent history, the development of the International Committee and our own analysis of the stage of the capitalist crisis. We are constantly, and the nature of the pseudo-left, we're constantly fighting to develop a political understanding, a political offensive which has to be waged, political delineation, But there is an enormous, so that's a constant fight, but there's an enormous basis for it. Precisely because you speak to workers. I know there's a question, maybe I'll speak more about it, about, the conversations with students and workers. I mean, there is an enormous political vacuum. The trade union apparatus does not command a broad support among workers. The Democratic Party doesn't command a broad support. The pseudo-left organizations do not have a significant base of support. There's all sorts of political conceptions that have to be clarified among workers. But we also recognize a profound change in the relationship of the Trotskyist movement to the working class, which is expressed in political developments. That there is an immense reservoir, and this I know is international, for a fight for Trotskyism in the working class. And that certainly has been an experience of our election campaign.
Yeah, and I think, it's the case here in our European elections at the moment, that really you can see how the Trotskyist principles of the independence of the working class, of internationalism, that the working class has to unify throughout all limits and throughout the boundaries of the nation state, religion, ethnicity, or something else. So the international unity of the working class, the whole experience of the Trotskyist movement to fight for the independence of the working class, that all this becomes very crucial at the moment in this political situation, but it also gets a growing resonance. I mean, it's just when I don't say that the problems in the working class are just away or something like that, or that it's not a complex political struggle that we have to wage, but you can see that that the questions we are answering are raised by the objective development. I mean, it's what we are witnessing is, again, the development of a world war. And so the question of the international unity of the working class becomes very decisive. And you can you can see how the ruling class is going back and returning to the methods of genocide. And that they are even risking a nuclear war in their confrontation with Russia. So all the questions coming back, the questions of the two world wars, and the Marxist and Trotskyist principles that were developed in response to this capitalist barbarism are getting, again, very decisive, but also somehow very much in line with objective development. That is a program workers have to adopt, which does not lessen our responsibility to fight for it, but which I think we have a very strong objective basis for it. What are your experiences so far with your election campaign and the response among workers and the discussions you had in the working class? I had the feeling some of the questions in the chat went into this direction somehow. What did you in your discussions? What are the political questions that are coming up?
Well, of course, many, and we talked about some of them. I've had hundreds of discussions about the war against Russia and the genocide in Gaza, its background. There's a question about memorable. One thing that I actually have taken to do when talking with workers and also students, and particularly that I'm talking about here in Michigan, where we're fighting to get on the ballot. And we've gotten a very, very powerful response. We have to fight. We have to get 12,000 signatures to get on the ballot, and we're going to do it. And if the SEP is prevented, it's because the Democratic Party is waging its all-out war on third parties. But we're getting an enormous response. But one of the questions I've taken to asking is, what do workers and young people understand by socialism? What does the word mean? And there's very, very interesting responses, which are revealing of some of the problems. One of the issues, of course, which often comes out, worker asks me once, isn't socialism communism, or what's, and of course there you have the issue of, because behind the question of communism, is its association with Stalinism, and all the issues of what happened in the 20th century, which immediately arise so often in discussions about the campaign. What the origins of Trotskyism? What was the Soviet Union? What was the Russian Revolution? Stalinism, the counter-revolution against the principles of October, the origins of the left opposition, the fight for internationalism versus nationalism. I had an extensive discussion with a number of Lebanese workers and professionals about, and it was a review of the history of the Middle East and the questions of nationalism, Trotskyism, as the theory of permanent revolution, the revolutionary role of the American working class. So these historical issues are very often very present. Explaining what socialism means. There's a lot of different associations of socialism. And of course, it's bound up with the lies of the capitalist media. There's some sections of workers who back Trump, and it's not because they're racist or want a fascist dictatorship. There's political confusion. There's an association of left politics with racial and identity politics, the slander of white workers as racists, which they have a hostility towards. And then the socialism is somehow associated as the politics of the Democratic Party. And, some of the discussions where one really exposes the real nature of the Democratic Party. And then you begin to find that, the support for Trump among workers is broad sections of workers is very thin. And you begin to undermine that. And there's a support for an international unity of the working class. I know Comrade Will Layman had this experience many, many times in his campaign for UAW president in speaking with workers. He spoke about it often, the response to the international perspective. But, the question of what socialism is, I remember one discussion I had with a worker, and he wanted to know what socialism was and what we would fight for. And you often get this. The question is, well, what would you do if you're in office? And of course, I explained to workers in the course of such discussions that it's not about, I'm going to win the presidency and single-handedly transform. What we're fighting to do is build a political movement in the working class. But that's the issue in a socialist leadership in the working class. But then explaining the policies of socialism. I had one discussion. I said, well, what would socialists do? We would expropriate the rich. We would transform the gigantic corporations into public utilities. We would fight for socialism means equality. Social equality is in the name of our party. Socialism is equality, an end to class rule, the abolition of the vast levels of wealth concentrated in the hands of the capitalist ruling elites. I can see as I was speaking, he's became very interested. Yes, okay, I'll sign that. That's what we need. And you start explaining to workers what socialism really is. And it's interesting, the responses. Again, sometimes you get a response about social. Really, one worker said, really, I have no idea. As he was signing the petition to put our candidates on the ballot, I don't know what socialism is. Can you explain to me what socialism is? So that fight continuously in the working class to explain the historical issues, to explain the relationship of socialism to the American working class and the working class as a whole. That is a conversation that we have, Jerry and I, continuously. I was speaking to someone yesterday, actually, who was from Indiana. And he said something about, Indiana is a red state. That is, it's a Republican state. And I just made the point, well, it was also the home of Eugene Debs, the great American socialist, the leader of the Pullman strike, who won 1 million votes while in prison for opposing the war. There's a proud, great tradition of socialism in the American working class, of class struggle, of socialists who were involved in all of the great class battles in America, internationalists, and explaining that history and really developing and reconnecting workers with that tradition of socialism, that is their tradition, that the movement of the working class, that the socialist movement is the working class movement in its most conscious form, that all the great struggles of workers have involved socialists, that socialism is the fight, it represents the interests of the working class, the fight against exploitation, the conversations we have, Jerry and I, about the nature of surplus value. Where does profit come from? That's another discussion that is often, well, where does the vast wealth of Elon Musk come from? Some sort of brilliant person? No, he exploits the labor of millions and millions of workers. The role of the markets as an instrument to simply transfer wealth from the working class to the rich. Anyway, there was a long answer to the question. These are the types of discussions. They're very interesting. I mean, the ballot access campaign here in Michigan has sort of, in a sense, been imposed upon us by the fact that you have to gather, and here again, 12,000 signatures. I think it's far more than you had to gather to get on the ballot for the European elections, right? That's just in one state. The anti-democratic restrictions in the United States make a farce of democracy. It's ridiculous. Everything is done to keep workers, to keep independent candidates, particularly socialists, off the ballot. But it also has been an enormous experience in just talking to workers and fighting out these issues in the working class. So fighting for workers to support the campaign. And we've won broad support. There's a great deal of interest, but it's also just, this is what we have to fight for throughout the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, similar experiences here in Europe. Where you have a clear opposition to the genocide, but also to the war against Russia, but where really you have to clarify the political issues in order to make this opposition conscious and really active. And that is, of course, a question of Stalinism, as you raised it. That is a fundamental question which is answered by the Trotskyist movement, by the founding of the Trotskyist movement, that proved that there is an alternative to Stalinism. It's the Trotskyist movement, the socialist movement. And as you just said, that really very fundamental questions are coming up. What is socialism? That is, of course, the case also here, which shows how really significant your election campaign is in order to raise the level of consciousness of the working class in the US and internationally, because it's, of course, the case, as you can see with this meeting here, that not just the US elections are followed throughout the world, but your campaign is followed by workers throughout the world, by of course, the most class conscious workers, and who are the ones who from Germany following this meeting now. I'm just looking if more questions came in. So it's a question on Will Lehman, which is probably significant because he conducted the fight against the trade unions and for the independence of the working class. And then the question if you have already a break with the UAW. I mean, which is particularly interesting, maybe in regard to the strike vote for the strike for in California to support the students, and which was sabotaged by the UAW bureaucracy.
Yeah. Well, we're fighting for the development of a rank and file rebellion against the apparatus of the trade union and the development of rank and file committees to transfer power to the shop floor. and to develop a coordinated offensive in the to fight for the interests of workers and to fight against war. There was a significant meeting that Jerry, the vice presidential candidate for the campaign, participated in yesterday. I think it was over 150 workers, academic workers, and other sections of the working class on the UC strike, the strike of University of California academic workers and other university workers, against the attack on the student protests against the genocide in Gaza. And as you were just referencing, the role of the UAW, and for those who don't know internationally, the United Auto Workers is also organized many other sections of the working class, or it has a presence in many other sections of the working class, including academic workers. There's 48,000 academic workers in the UC system. There was a vote for strike authorization against the crackdown on protests against the genocide, particularly at UCLA, where the administration welcomed the police, who first stood by as right-wing Zionists waged a rampage against the encampment at UCLA, and then the police came in after that and arrested people. There was a strike authorization vote, and there was overwhelming support for a strike. The UAW then proceeded to organize what they called a stand-up strike, modeled off of the stand-up strike of Sinn Féin, the president, last year, which was used to shut down the struggle of auto workers and impose contracts that have led to mass layoffs. What I mean by stand-up strike is really that the majority of the workers remain on the job throughout the strike. I mean, it is, linguistic inversion. It's a strike, which is a non-strike. It's a non-strike strike. Everyone's working. The vast majority of the workers are working during the strike. This is Sinn Féin's great innovation. You have a strike, which most workers don't strike. So that's what they're trying to do to the UC system. There's enormous, there is actually a growing movement. There's been statements, including by the Students for Justice in Palestine, calling for an all-out strike of all the workers at the UC system. We've been fighting for it and winning a very strong response. And we're fighting to develop within the working class, among auto workers, support for the students. I can say that you were speaking to auto workers. The only people who are informing auto workers that there's even a strike happening at the University of California of workers in the same union that they are in is the Socialist Equality Party. That we're fighting to alert workers and mobilize workers to behind the strikers. I mean, in terms of the apparatus, and support, there's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of support for the development of a rank and file rebellion against the apparatus. Féin was sort of brought in and was very closely tied in with the Democratic Party, the Biden administration. He was in constant discussion with Biden throughout the stand-up strike last year and boasted of it, Féin. He was really brought in an attempt to give a facelift, but it's a poor facelift. It's a not very effective facelift because it's in fact the apparatus, and this was what was so powerful about Will Lehman's campaign, exposing the nature of the apparatus as a whole. And one of the points he made was that the only thing that would change if Féin came into power is his own salary, and that's proven to be true. And workers see that. The stand-up strike itself. I've had many discussions with workers about that. Many say, there was a strike and we were never on strike. Workers at Warren Truck Plant and elsewhere. So there is that sentiment, certainly. That one of the consequences of the right-wing trajectory of the whole political framework and the UAW, the trade union apparatus, is part of that. One of the consequences is that they don't have a real base of support in the working class. So there, again, it's what we're speaking about. There's an enormous objective basis, but we have to fight to realize that through the political fight of the IC.
Yeah, I mean, I have the feeling what really comes through in this discussion is that workers around the world are confronted with very similar questions. I mean, here the trade unions immediately after the start of the Ukraine war joined the government in the so-called konzertierte Aktion, concerted action, where the government, the trade unions, and the companies are sitting together and discussing how to basically push through the war policy, how to get the. And they decided on enormous wage cuts, real wage cuts, which were implemented then by the trade unions against the workers. And yeah, you have same development, of course, throughout the world, which shows again there is no path for the working class than a socialist revolution. There is, I mean, shown very clearly by the role played by the trade union bureaucracy. I mean, they are completely on the side of the companies, of the government, and they are the police force of the government and the companies against the working class. That is very clear, and you just explained it in California, and yeah, but it's very, very similar here. So really the question of the independence of the working class from all these organizations is very crucial, even for the most basic defense of democratic social rights of the workers. Yeah, but I think I mean we raised a lot of questions in this discussion. We will have, of course, a further discussion on Thursday here to go over this interview again and to go into some questions in more detail. So everybody who listened to this interview is very welcome to join us in this meeting on Thursday, which will be done as an online conference where everybody can speak. And in order to participate, you have to register at gleichheit.de/Termine. So because I think, yeah, this meeting showed two things. On the one hand, how workers are really internationally confronted with the same basic issues, of course, of world war, of social devastation. They are confronted with the trade unions, with the pseudo-left organizations, and with a united front of all the bourgeois parties who are pushing the war policy and the dictatorships through. At the same time, your remarks made very clear. There is a social force that is able to stop this. And this is the American and the international working class. And I think it also became very clear what political and historical issues have to be clarified in order to really make this social force a real power and to develop a real working class, a socialist working class movement that is fighting against not just war, but against its root, the capitalist system. So from this view, I would conclude the meeting. If there are not other questions, or if you want to add something, Joe?
Well, I had some questions. I wanted to ask you more as well about your experiences there. I would say just one thing, which has been really striking for workers and young people here, to see the images of German police, again, beating protesters. I'm also somewhat curious if, I know we're coming towards the end of the meeting, but the experience that you're having with workers and young people, because the party there has carried out such important work on, you referred to it briefly, on exposing Babarovsky, on the Verfassungsschutz, on exposing the efforts to trivialize the crimes of the Nazis. Your own book on this question is very critical for the international movement, and understand and exposing the sort of revival of fashion, the AFD, but not just the AFD. And I'm curious, actually, if to what extent that the discussions with workers on the protests over the genocide, the response on some of these historical questions. Sorry to ask the question towards the end, but the other point I would just do, which goes to your issue, or the point you were just stressing, on the question of the revolutionary role of the American working class. It's something which has distinguished our movement, the Trotskyist movement, throughout its history, and certainly the Trotskyist movement here in the United States, the Workers' League. Going back to Healy's letter on the founding of the Workers' League in 1966, when we said, the revolutionary forces in the American working class, and the perspective of the Workers' League on the fight to mobilize the working class, or the attitude on the question of the Vietnam War and the fight to turn and develop a movement in the working class, the immense confidence which the Trotskyist movement has always had in the revolutionary role of the American working class in opposition to all the various, Stalinists, Maoists, and other organizations. And I think it's a very critical issue for workers and young people throughout the world to understand, again, that there are two Americas. There's the America of the corporate financial oligarchy. There's the America of the CIA and of the military and of the bombs and the bases all over the world of Wall Street. And there's the American working class, which is an enormously powerful social force, which, if united with the workers all over the world, is capable of overturning capitalism, overturning imperialism, ending the descent into barbarism, stopping the genocide, stopping the descent into fascist dictatorship. That is an enormously powerful social force. And it's, when that force is really develops a understanding and begins to understand that it is fighting for socialism. Now, this isn't something far off in the distance. This is something we're fighting for. That will transform all of world politics. And so it's just, I just want to stress that point, which our perspective is rooted in, and what we're fighting for in the U.S. elections.
Yes, and as I stressed at the beginning, this is absolutely fundamental. And that is coming up here on meetings. Just on our last meeting, the question came up. If there's a revolution in Germany or in Europe, wouldn't the US imperialism not push the red button? So is there any way to have a revolution? That was a question. And we said, well, there is the American working class. That is a social force that is able to fight imperialism. And but it's, of course, a question of the international working class. The aim of our party is to mobilize the international working class. And we are very aware that this needs a political struggle. And I think we got a much better understanding of this political struggle you're waging at the moment in the US, and how deeply it is connected to the struggle we are waging here in our European elections. I mean, all the central issues are the same. And in this regard, of course, the experiences we have here with the return of fascism in Germany is very significant internationally. Because this was a country, or this is a country, of the greatest crimes in history. The war of extermination, the Holocaust, and all this came out of the specific position of German imperialism, and out of this, and out of the deep contradictions of capitalism. And now the German ruling elite is back to its roots. And it's really the biggest cynicism that they are arguing in this with the fight against anti-Semitism. No, I mean we showed it 10 years ago when the German government announced the end of German military restraint, and that now we are back on the world stage. And in the same year, Bobrovsky published this, or he was quoted in an article that Hitler was not vicious, and that the Holocaust was basically the same than shootings in the Russian Civil War, and starting really relativizing and minimalizing the crimes of the Nazis in an incredible way. And we explained at that time, that is the purpose of this is to whitewash German history in order to commit new crimes. And this is very much vindicated now, and especially vindicated with this whole campaign now for war, and they can call it anti-Semitism as often as they want. It's the opposite. They are cracking down on anti-war protests, and they are in line again, and they are again in their brown traditions, by suppressing anybody who is fighting against their war policy. That is very clear, and that finds a very clear expression in the fact that all the defenders of Bobrovsky are now the biggest fighters against anti-Semitism, as well as the AfD itself. They are saying that the Holocaust is just a bird shit in 2,000 years of proud German history, and now they are the spearhead of the fight against anti-Semitism. I mean, you can't invent it. It's but it's the same struggle. We started 10 years ago, and it is of great significance here. But it's not just a German question. It's a question of capitalism, and the same questions are come up in every single country, as you can say in the US with Trump on the one hand, and on the other hand, genocide Biden, who's supporting genocide, and at the same time establishing dictatorship in the US to suppress any opposition to it. So these questions are now very much international questions, and so the German history is, of course, of greatest significance, because there you could see where capitalism leads to. And all these fundamental contradictions are breaking up again, and that is why you have the development again towards fascism and war. And that's why our joint campaign, your campaign in the US, our campaign at the European elections, and now also our British comrades, and we will probably have also a meeting with them, are standing in the national elections. And of course, for us, the elections are not in the center. We are using them to build an international movement of the working class on the basis of a socialist program, and on the basis of the whole heritage of the Trotskyist movement, which discussion and endurance of this fight, and the necessity of this fight in order to stop World War III and really mobilize the working class as an independent force which is able to stop this.
Just on the last point you made, Trump retweeted something the other day which referred to the American Reich, which he was going to establish if elected. This is the character of American politics now. But as you said, it's not just Trump; it's also Biden, the Democratic Party. I mean, it's the return of barbarism. But I think I appreciate very much the discussion. I think the question of fighting to unify workers in the United States with workers in Germany, throughout Europe, and around the world. I mean, this is the great question. And as you say, the election campaign, I mean, we're running in the elections here, and as you are in there, to fight for a program in the working class. and to really break the sort of political stranglehold of official politics, which is wearing thin, but it needs to now take a conscious form through the fight of workers for socialism, workers joining the movement, young people, students that becoming actively involved in this fight to build a socialist leadership in the working class all over the world. That is the question, as you said. So again, thank you for having me, and I very much appreciated the opportunity to speak to workers and young people in Germany about the issues in the United States.
Yeah, and thank you very much that we had you. And maybe just in the conclusion at the end, keep in mind that we have the discussion of this video on Thursday at 7 o'clock online at gleichheit.de/Termine. And please keep in mind that we have on our final election rally taking place in Berlin on Saturday at 12 noon in Berlin-Wedding, and there we want also to have a lot of also international speakers. We want to really explain our perspectives, the socialist perspectives, the perspective of the international unity of the working class against the genocide, against Third World War. Us at this rally on Saturday, join us in the online discussion and support our election campaign. Go to gleichheit.de/mitmachen and register to support our election campaign, to take part in the international fight for socialism, which find in this meeting, I think, a very strong expression. So thank you very much again, Joe. Thank you very much to the audience, and join the fight for socialism.